Windows Virtual Desktop is now generally available. In this video, I set it up. A few months ago, when Windows Virtual Desktop went into public preview, I did a handful of videos that walked through deploying and configuring the service. They got a lot of views, and I thank everyone who watched. Now that Windows Virtual Desktop is GA, I'm going to redo the videos, update with changes, and also address some of the common questions and issues people ran into while in preview. Please don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications of new content. Subscribers are the fuel that my channel runs on. That and coffee. Lots and lots of coffee. Thanks. Let's jump into it with what Windows Virtual Desktop is. Windows Virtual Desktop is a Platform as a Service, or PaaS, application and desktop virtualization service that runs in Azure. If you utilize remote desktop services or any other remote desktop or VDI solution, you should certainly look into Windows Virtual Desktop. Windows Virtual Desktop has a lot of similarities to remote desktop services, or RDS. First, it presents a desktop or application to a remote user with an experience similar to running local. There are a lot of reasons why people use remote desktop or remote app services, but some of the advantages are applications can run in the data center close to the application servers, and management can be centralized. Also, some may want to separate the content from the device. This is useful for bring your own device environments where organizations may not have control over the user's device. Windows Virtual Desktop also runs on just about any device. There are clients for Windows, Macs, mobile devices. There's also an HTML5 client that extends its usability. Also new with Windows Virtual Desktop is a version of Windows 10 that supports multiple users. Users don't need to connect to a server OS anymore for remote desktops and apps. This means you don't need different group policies and application packages for servers and desktop OSs. You can still run remote desktop on Server 2012 R2 and above if required. Lastly, for those who can't migrate off of Windows 7 before its end of life, Microsoft is offering extended security updates for Windows 7 in Windows Virtual Desktop. To illustrate the advantages of Windows Virtual Desktop, let's first look at basic RDS deployments. To get RDS running and accessible publicly, you would need the following: servers running remote desktop web and remote desktop gateway, connection brokers, load balancer, and SQL databases to support HA. And we haven't even talked about the servers the users interact with. Those are located in session host pools. A separate pool is required for remote apps and remote desktops. Now compare that to Windows Virtual Desktop. The web app and gateway, connection broker, and SQL are all part of a PaaS Windows Virtual Desktop service. There's no charge for the Windows Virtual Desktop service. You are only charged for the infrastructure as a service, or IaaS host, running in the host pools, data transfers, and storage cost. Also, notice I left off the licensing server. That's because you don't need RDS CALs if you use Windows 10 multi-user or another desktop OS. You do need them, however, if you run Server OS in the host pool. That's a good segue to licensing requirements. The Windows 10 or 7 connection requires one of the Microsoft 365 or Windows E licenses shown on the screen. As mentioned before, running Server OS still requires a client access license. On to infrastructure requirements. You will need Windows AD syncing to Azure AD to follow along in this video. Not sure what the difference is? You're not alone. I'll post a link to a video above I did a while ago with the differences between Microsoft Active Directory services. Pay attention to the note at the bottom of the slide. I'll also add a link in the comments below. This indicates that Azure AD domain services, not to be confused with Azure AD, is only supported if the users are sourced from Azure AD, not if they are sourced from Windows AD. I'll cover Azure AD domain services and Windows Virtual Desktop in an upcoming video. Again, if all of the Active Directories are confusing, take a look at that video. Hosts must be domain or hybrid AD joined. This is critically important and a point that trips a lot of people up while implementing Windows Virtual Desktop. The host joins the domain at the time of deployment, or the deployment will error. Network connectivity needs to be in place before the deployment. I'll cover this more when I do the deployment in the demo. If there's network restrictions in place, the host will need access over port 443 to the links on the screen. Also, hosts will need access to other Azure resources such as Azure AD, storage, Azure Files, I have seen a few Azure IIS implementations become unstable by network restrictions. Remember, even an IaaS server is a cloud service that needs access to the other cloud endpoints. Round trip time should be under 150 milliseconds between the client and the Windows Virtual Desktop region, and traffic may flow outside the region or even country. Okay, it's vocabulary time. Let's start with Azure AD. We've established that is a requirement. Next, we have a Windows Virtual Desktop tenant. This is an interface to manage Windows Virtual Desktop. Don't get it confused with an Azure subscription tenant. That's something different. I need to point out that there is something called a tenant group for managing multiple Windows Virtual Desktop tenants. That's useful for cloud service providers. Most organizations won't need to be concerned with this. If you are interested, leave a message below. If I get enough responses, I'll do a video on that as well. In the tenant are host pools. This is the pool of VMs that host user sessions. These can be either personal or pooled. Personal has a one-to-one mapping between users and hosts. This is required for Windows 7 and Windows 10 without multiple users. The other host pool is called a pooled host pool. This requires Windows 10 multi-user or a server OS. Users share resources on the VMs. Users are assigned to app groups. There is one app group created by default called the Desktop Application Group. This is the app group used to share a desktop. This can be removed and recreated, but there can only be one app group in a host pool. A host pool can have multiple remote app groups. These are used for publishing applications, not desktops. So for example, one remote app group could be used for Office applications and another for accounting applications. One last point, and this is a point that seems somewhat limiting to me. A user can be part of a desktop app group or multiple remote app groups in a host pool, but not a desktop and remote app group in the same host pool. If the user needs access to both desktop group and app group, that would require two host pools. Let's move on to setting up Windows Virtual Desktop. The first 3 steps only need to be done once in a subscription. If you have already deployed Windows Virtual Desktop services, you can skip these steps. First, I grant Windows Virtual Desktop permissions to Azure AD. After that, I assign the tenant creator role to the user. Once that's finished, I create the tenant. Lastly, I deploy and connect to a host pool. So let's get to it. Buckle up everyone, it's demo time. So the first thing I'm going to do is add permission to the Windows Virtual Desktop services to Azure Active Directory. And this is something you only need to do once. So if you've already ran through Windows Virtual Desktop setup once, you probably already have this in place. But if you're new, you'll need to do this first. So I'm going to paste a link in here and it'll ask me to sign in. I'm going to use my On Microsoft account. So you can't use an account that's external. So for example, I use a Gmail account frequently to manage my Azure subscription. That account is external, so it won't work. I have an onmicrosoft.com account that I can use. That's the actual first account I got set up in the subscription. That's the one that I'll use to give permission to Windows Virtual Desktop. And here it asks if you would like to give this app all the rights listed there. I'm going to click yes or accept and move on to the next step. I'm actually not going to hit accept because I've done this once already. I'm going to move on to the next step, which is adding permission to Windows Virtual Desktop Client. This is another URL, so I'll just add it in here. And I'll add these URLs to the description below. I'll also have it on my website as part of this post. Microsoft does recommend waiting a minute between these two actions. So if you're following along, you might want to just pause here and wait a minute so the first one can replicate and finish before moving on to the next. I'm going to move on to the third step now, which is assigning tenant creator app role. So let me move over to the portal. Here I am in the portal. I'm going to go to all services and find enterprise applications. There it is. And under applications, I'm going to search for Windows Virtual Desktop. And next, I'm going to select the Windows Virtual Desktop, not the client, just the Windows Virtual Desktop. Next, I'm going to go to Users and Groups. And you can see I have 3 of them here. But if you just set this up new, you'll probably only have one that has default access. Default access is not enough. You need tenant creator. If you only have default access, go to Add User. And I'm going to select a user. I'm just going to add this user. I know it's blurred out for you, but it's a test user account. So I selected a user. It's going to give it the only role available is tenant creator. Click assign, and that will assign that user tenant creator rights to your Windows Virtual Desktop deployment. And again, I already set this up, so I'm not actually going to click that, but I think this should help anybody who is setting this up brand new. The last thing I'm going to walk through before deploying a Windows Virtual Desktop is adding the Windows Virtual Desktop tenant. In order to do that, you have to be a member of that tenant creator group, so make sure the account you're using is assigned that role. I need two pieces of information for this. The first is the Azure Active Directory tenant ID, and the next is the subscription ID. So if we go in and search for Azure Active Directory, and if you go down to Properties, you'll see a directory ID. Copy that and paste it someplace safe. That's going to be the first piece of information you'll need for a command. Next, you'll need the subscription ID, and you can get that by going to All Services and typing in subscription. I actually have it right here. And here it is. So just highlight that, copy, paste. You're going to need that as a second part for the command. To create the tenant, I have to do that in PowerShell, so I'm going to hop over to PowerShell quick. Here I am in PowerShell. Let's sign in quick. I typed in connect AZ account. You can also use connect Azure RM account if you're still using the older modules. That brings up a sign-in screen. For this, I'm using an account that has tenant creator rights. It doesn't need to be the account we used to set up permission at the very beginning. I'm logged in. The next step is to connect to the Windows Virtual Desktop service. I do that with this command here. So I'll just highlight that and hit F8. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? That's right. So one point that I'll bring up now, since you see the red on my screen, is I have to install the RDS modules. I'm going to do that with the install module name microsoft.rdinfra.rdPowerShell. These are the PowerShell modules needed to manage Windows Virtual Desktop. And I have to be an admin to do it. So not to be too confusing, I'm just running another version of PowerShell as administrator. I'm going to paste those in. This will install the modules. And once they're installed on this machine, they'll be available in the session that I have behind this window. Looks like that finished up. Let's minimize that. Let's be sure they're available. We can do that by running the import module and then the name of the module. There it goes. Now I have those modules installed. Let's try it again. And you'll sit here and act like it's doing nothing, but in your taskbar, you should see a window pop up for a sign-in. I'm going to sign in again, and this does need to be an account that is native to your Azure Active Directory. Again, so I can't use my Gmail account for this. So I'll use an on Microsoft account for this one. There I am. The command you'll run is going to look something like this. First, we're going to have the new RDS tenant, and then the name. And give that a name. It's going to stick around for a while, so I guess you can recreate it, but this is going to be the main tenant that you interact with. And then your Azure AD tenant ID, and we got that from a previous step, but that's in Azure AD under Properties. And then your Azure subscription ID, and that is located under within your subscription. So if you go into subscriptions, it'll be right there on the first page. Once completed, you should get an output that looks similar to this with your tenant group name, which is the default tenant group. Again, most people will only have one of those, and then a tenant name. So those were the first 3 steps you need to take care of. Maybe it was 4. For prepping your environment for Windows Virtual Desktop. First step was to grant permission to the Windows Virtual Desktop service to Azure AD. After that, I granted permissions to the Windows Virtual Desktop client. Then I assigned the tenant creator role to a user in my environment. And last, I created an RDS tenant. And in order to do that, I did have to download the PowerShell modules. Here I am back in the portal. Let's set up a Windows Virtual Desktop. So to do that, I'm going to start by going to Add. I'll type in Windows Virtual Desktop. There it is, Windows Virtual Desktop, provision a host pool. I'll click Create, and I'll add a few things. First, I'm going to create new for a resource group. I'll leave the subscription as it is. I'll call it Host Pool RG for a resource group. I'll leave it in the central region. The host pool name, I'll just call this host pool. 1. I'm not feeling creative. And under desktop type, we have pooled or personal. And as I said before, pooled is for shared desktops. In order to use pooled, I need to use either Windows 10 multi-user or a server OS. Personal is a one-to-one mapping between user and desktop. That would be used for like if you're running Windows 7 or Windows 10 non-multi-user. For the default desktop user, I'm just going to put one user in. You can add more as you need. And I believe it says, yeah, you can add multiple by adding a comma. And under service metadata location, I'm going to leave it as United States. Here it's asking what your user load is going to be. I'm going to go to light, and I'm going to just switch this to 5. And it's telling me that it's going to be 3 standard D8 SV3, which seems a little bit large. Oh, there, dropped it to 1 when I tabbed out of there, but I want to change the size. I find for labs, the B series are more economical. And I also like to make sure that they're not so small that it takes forever to get anything done. So yeah, my under the pricing that I have, cost per month is only $43 for a B2S. That's 2 cores and 4 gigs of RAM. So that will work just fine. But I do need more. I want to have more than 1 for this demo. So let's go to 10. From this wizard, you can't select a specific number of VMs. It kind of does a calculation for you. I did 10 and it's still at 1. Let's do 15. There, now it changed to 2 of the standard B2S. And the virtual machine prefix, I'm just going to put temp HP. Let's just call it that. And one thing to note, it will add a dash after that. So these will be named temp HP-0-1 and so on. Virtual machine settings. Here's where we pick the image. So you can do blob storage. If you have an image on blob storage, you can also find a managed image if you have that. I'm going to go from the gallery though. And I'll go over those more in a future video. And I do want to do the Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session with Office 365 Pro Plus. For the disk type, I'm going to go a little bit less expensive on this. I'll do a standard hard drive. And I need to add some information to join the domain. So these virtual machines, when they are deployed, they do need to be added to a domain. So I would suggest having an account dedicated to that. Let me just put it in there. And next I need to enter in the password. I will specify a domain OU. So now it's asking for the domain. I'll add my domain in and I'm going to give it an OU. This OU is where the virtual machines will be located when they're added to Active Directory. The last part of this page is configuring the network. Microsoft still gives the option to create a new VNet on deployment. And unfortunately, this will fail. The reason being is, as I said before, and as we just walked through, these VMs need access to a domain. And if you create a new VNet, there's not going to be any domain controller that it can communicate with, so therefore it'll fail. By default, a VNet will not be able to route traffic to another VNet unless there's some sort of connectivity, either with VPN or VNet peering involved. So if I leave this as a default, it will fail. So I'm going to select an existing VNet, and I'm also going to select a subnet and make sure that that subnet has access to a domain controller. Any subnet can route between other subnets in a VNet by default, but if there's network security groups put in place, that may prevent it. So if you do run into an error with this, I have an article on my blog that goes over it in more detail, but basically if you can add a virtual machine on a subnet and then add that virtual machine to a domain, you should be okay. If you can't add just a standalone machine to a domain on a subnet, and then you select that subnet during this deployment, it will fail. Also, in addition to accessing Active Directory, the subnet also needs access to all of the URLs that I pointed out earlier, and any other service such as desired state configuration endpoints. If you lock down your network, you may run into errors and need to open up the subnet to the internet for the deployment. Okay, now it's asking me for my Windows Virtual Desktop tenant group and tenant name. I can get that if I hop over to PowerShell and run the get RDS tenant command. There it is. My tenant group is default tenant group, and tenant name is Seraltos. So I'll just copy that. Let's go back to the portal. The last step before I review and create, I'm going to add the user who will own this. I'll use the same user I've used before, the onmicrosoft.com account. And I'll note that you do have the option also to use a service principal. That should be used if you have MFA enabled, or really it's probably the better practice just to use that instead of a user account to own Windows RDS. My next video I'm going to go over will be over using a service principal instead of a UPN. For the UPN, I just disabled MFA on that account and I'm moving forward, but it's pretty important to be able to use a service principal instead of an actual user. So I'll review and create. Validation passed. Everything looks good, and I'll hit create. I'll give it a few minutes and come back. I'm back and the deployment is finished. Here you can see the resource group has been created. All the virtual machines are in place along with disks, network interfaces, and availability set. Go in and look and see that this is running. There it is. Let's log into these virtual machines. I'll open up an incognito window and I'll just paste in the web client URL. rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com/web-client, and that is the same for everybody. It'll ask me to sign in, and I'm going to sign in with that one account I set up for access to this. There's the host pool. Let me click on that. Next, it'll ask me for access to the clipboard and printer. I'll click allow. And that's going to open it up. Next, it's going to connect. Here I'll enter that username and password again. The first login was logging into the web client. The second login is logging into the actual VM. And here's the desktop. I can maximize this if I want to see it full screen. And here's my full desktop. When I'm done, I can just disconnect and go back to the browser window. That's it. That's how you configure Windows Virtual Desktop in your subscription and deploy your first host pool. That's all there is to it. Stay tuned for my next video on using service principals with the deployment. Subscribe and click the bell icon to get notifications of new content. Thanks for watching.